Imagine lying down to sleep after a day of endless work, the kind of exhaustion that presses against your bones and dulls your thoughts. In the medieval world, when you reached for your rest, it was rarely a private act. To go to bed was to enter into a social contract, one filled with unspoken rules, quiet negotiations, and an acceptance of proximity that would feel suffocating to you now. A bed was not always yours alone. In fact, for most people, sleep meant sharing. The shared bed was a defining element of daily life, an arrangement shaped by scarcity, practicality, and culture. Beds were expensive. They required wood for frames, straw or feathers for stuffing, and heavy fabric for coverings. For the poor, even straw was a luxury. Whole families often pressed together on simple sacks of chaff, huddled for warmth through winter nights. In taverns or inns, a paying traveler did not rent a private chamber. He or she purchased space in a bed already holding strangers. To refuse was not an option if you needed rest on a journey. The phrase, "to bed with someone," was often literal, and it carried no automatic implication of intimacy, only necessity. But with necessity came rules. To sleep alongside strangers demanded boundaries, subtle gestures, and an awareness of etiquette. You did not sprawl. You did not take more blanket than your share. You avoided unnecessary talk after the candle was snuffed. Some records suggest that when beds were filled with unrelated men and women, strict expectations of modesty were assumed. In some regions, boards or bolsters divided sleeping spaces. In others, each sleeper kept to a practice stillness, knowing that to overstep was to risk insult, suspicion, or worse. In aristocratic households, the practice persisted, though with more refinement. Noble families often had large beds with carved frames, thick mattresses, and embroidered canopies. Yet even these were not private sanctuaries. Servants sometimes shared the foot of the bed, ladies-in-waiting kept watch nearby, and children often nestled in beside their parents. Privacy was alien to the medieval mind. To sleep with others around you was a marker of trust and connection, not of intrusion. Even kings, when traveling, often shared their chambers with trusted companions or officials. The bedchamber was not only a place of rest but also of politics, strategy, and bonding. The reasons for bed sharing were not only economic but also environmental. Medieval buildings were drafty, poorly insulated, and cold. Fireplaces provided limited warmth, and in many homes the hearth was extinguished at night to preserve fuel. A shared bed became the only defense against freezing air. To press close to another body was to survive. In the deep of winter, even enemies or rivals might share warmth if necessity forced it. The intimacy of shared sleep was less a matter of choice than of endurance. Yet the memory of such arrangements did not vanish quietly into history. Writers and moralists occasionally commented on the potential dangers. Priests warned against temptation when young men and women lay too near. Legal documents recorded disputes where accusations arose from shared beds. Yet in daily practice, people learned to navigate the arrangement. They knew when to turn, when to breathe quietly, when to pretend to sleep to avoid awkward conversation. It was a skill, as essential to life then as the ability to cook, weave, or carry water. If you imagine yourself in such a bed, consider what it would feel like. The straw beneath you shifts with every movement. The wool blanket itches against your skin. The breath of another touches your neck, and their body radiates heat against yours. You listen to the creak of timbers above, the distant cry of an animal in the street, the muffled cough of someone on the far side of the room. There is no silence, no solitude. Rest must come despite the closeness, or perhaps because of it. You belong to the group, even in your dreams. But what happened when tempers flared, when someone took more space than they should, or when suspicion crept into the bedchamber? How did people enforce the unspoken rules when privacy was a luxury none could afford? When you think of a bed today, you likely imagine personal space, a place of withdrawal from the noise of the world. But for medieval people, the bed was often the opposite. It was a site of interaction, negotiation, and tension. Section 1 introduced the simple reality that people shared beds out of necessity. Now, let us move deeper into the rules that governed such an arrangement, for without them, disorder and suspicion would have made nightly rest impossible. The first rule was silence. Once the candle was blown out, words were to be few. A bed shared with family, servants, or strangers was not a place for idle chatter. Whispered exchanges might spark suspicion, especially if men and women lay close. Silence was considered both a sign of respect and a safeguard of reputation. A late-night conversation could lead to rumors in the morning, for walls were thin and ears were everywhere. The second rule was stillness. To toss and turn was to disturb the others, and in a crowded bed, the movement of one body rippled outward like a wave. Manuals of conduct, rare but revealing, hint that self-control was admired even in sleep. You were expected to choose a position, keep to it, and surrender to rest without undue shifting. Those unable to do so risked mockery or complaint. Stillness was not just courtesy, it was survival. In a bed of straw, too much movement released chaff into the air, and breathing became uncomfortable. The third rule was modesty. It was assumed that men and women, unless married, would lie fully clothed. Nightshirts, shifts, or even daytime garments served as barriers of propriety. To undress entirely was rare outside the marital bed and could be seen as indecent, even threatening. Inns and hostels sometimes issued warnings to guests. Keep your clothes on, keep your hands to yourself, and remember that the bed is not yours alone. Modesty was as practical as it was moral. Clothing added a layer of warmth, and it marked the line between necessity and impropriety. There were also unspoken rules about hierarchy. In a noble household, the master and mistress claimed the head of the bed, while children or servants crowded the lower spaces. In inns, the wealthy traveler might pay for the more favorable side of the mattress, leaving the edge or the colder spot near the draught to poorer companions. In monasteries, novices might sleep at the feet of their elders, arranged according to rank. To break these patterns was to invite conflict. Sleeping position could reflect a social standing as clearly as a title or a piece of jewelry. But what happened when these rules were ignored? Disputes were common. Court records preserve curious cases where arguments over bed sharing escalated into violence. In one medieval inn, a traveler accused his bedfellow of theft in the night, claiming that money had been taken while they lay together. In another, a man complained that his partner's restless snoring robbed him of sleep, leading to blows before dawn. These stories remind us that the shared bed was not a haven of peace but a place of constant negotiation, where civility could collapse into accusation with alarming ease. Religious authorities were deeply aware of these dangers. Preachers warned against mixed sleeping arrangements, fearing the temptation of lust. Monastic rules dictated strict separation of genders, and even among monks, sleeping arrangements were carefully regulated. Some abbeys required brothers to sleep in separate cubicles, while others allowed dormitories but insisted on distance between beds. The risk was not only sin but scandal. The bed, after all, was the most intimate of places, and even the perception of impropriety could taint a reputation beyond repair. Yet, despite warnings, the practice persisted. Families could not afford separate rooms. Inns could not provide private beds for every guest. Soldiers in the field shared blankets against the cold, and apprentices traveling for work huddled together in hostels. Bed sharing was a fact of life, and rules evolved to make it tolerable. These rules were rarely written down, but they lived in the habits of countless ordinary people. They shaped the rhythm of nights, the texture of dreams, and the boundaries of trust. The deeper question is this: how did people balance the constant closeness of bed sharing with the need for individual identity? What did it mean to live in a world where even your dreams were not entirely your own, where the act of lying down bound you to others in silence and stillness? Could true privacy exist at all in such a world? The world of medieval knights was not only defined by rules but also by exceptions. While the expected silence, stillness, and modesty helped preserve order, human nature was never entirely obedient. Within the dim candlelight of shared rooms and crowded inns, people found ways to bend, stretch, and sometimes ignore these codes. Section 3 must now examine the realities that emerged when those forgotten rules clashed with desire, fatigue, or simple necessity. To begin, you must imagine a medieval inn at the end of a long day's travel. The road is muddy. The cartwheels have churned the path into ruts, and every joint in your body aches from hours on horseback or on foot. You arrive at the doorway, desperate not for comfort, but for relief. The innkeeper greets you with a weary smile and gestures toward the common chamber, where straw mattresses are lined up against the wall. They are already occupied. A merchant snores heavily on one side. A soldier mumbles in his sleep on the other. You are told to lie between them, fully clothed, and surrender to exhaustion. In such a situation, rules lose their force. You may not be still. You may not be silent. The ache in your bones, the cough of your neighbor, the restless shifting of horses outside, all combine to make sleep elusive. The records of travelers speak of these nights. Erasmus of Rotterdam, writing centuries later, recalled the indignity of lying next to strangers who carried lice or worse. Others complained of the odor, sweat, leather, ale, and smoke mingling into a stench that lingered until morning. For many, the rule of silence was an impossible demand, for grumbling and muttering were their only release. Bed sharing, they noted, was not merely uncomfortable but humiliating, a reminder that individual preference mattered little in a world governed by necessity. Families, too, wrestled with the fragility of these rules. A household might crowd into a single chamber, parents at the head of the bed, children clustered around them. Infants nursed in the night, toddlers cried, older siblings kicked in their sleep. Silence and stillness were ideals, not realities. To share a bed was also to share sickness. Fevers spread easily when bodies were pressed together. A cough at one end of the mattress soon became a household affliction. Diaries and parish records confirm outbreaks of illness that moved with terrifying speed through crowded homes, carried as much by the intimacy of sleep as by the bustle of day. And yet, even in such conditions, people found comfort. To a child frightened of storms, the presence of siblings offered reassurance. To a widow left alone, the warmth of a companion could mean safety. Bed sharing was not only a burden, but sometimes a solace. The rules, while stern, existed to preserve this balance, to allow closeness without chaos, intimacy without impropriety. But the line was always fragile, and countless stories survive of the times when it was crossed. Legal archives reveal cases where accusations arose from a night in the wrong bed. A servant girl discovered in the chamber of her master was immediately the subject of suspicion. A traveler who claimed he had lain innocently beside a woman in an inn found himself accused of misconduct. The act of bed sharing was so ordinary that it could be innocent, but it was also so intimate that it could be damning. Words spoken in the dark could echo in daylight as evidence, and reputations once damaged were rarely repaired. The Church never ceased to worry about this ambiguity. Confessors warned parishioners that mixed sleeping arrangements could lead to sin. Monks were told to guard their thoughts even in dreams, for temptation was believed to creep silently into the mind when the body lay vulnerable. Women were urged to protect their honor by refusing suspicious arrangements, though poverty often left them no choice. When moralists described the dangers of the bed, they spoke as though it were a battleground, where virtue and vice struggled side by side. But beneath moral warnings and legal disputes lay the constant fact of survival. In a cold climate with limited fuel, sharing a bed meant life. The warmth of another body was sometimes the only barrier against freezing nights. Soldiers camped together in the field, peasants huddled together in cottages, travelers wrapped themselves in one another's cloaks. For all the risks of rumor and impropriety, the alternative was often worse. To sleep alone in winter could mean never waking again. What does this reveal about the medieval sense of self? We today imagine privacy as a natural right, the boundary of the individual protected by walls, doors, and locks. But in a world where space was scarce, privacy was a luxury. The body was communal, its movements, noises, and even its warmth shared with others. To be an individual at night was almost impossible. You were always part of a cluster, always entangled in the lives and needs of those around you. And so, the forgotten rules of medieval bed-sharing tell us not only how people slept, but how they understood themselves. Silence, stillness, modesty. These were not merely bedtime manners. They were tools for survival in a world without solitude. To sleep was to trust, to accept that your body would lie vulnerable among others. And each morning, when you rose, you carried not only your dreams, but the unspoken memory of that shared vulnerability. Yet one question lingers. How did people reconcile this constant intimacy with the deep human longing for separation, for space, for the solitude of the self? Did they dream of privacy, even as they huddled together in crowded rooms? Or did they learn to find freedom within the boundaries of closeness, shaping their identities not against others but alongside them? The forgotten rules of medieval bed-sharing were shaped not only by custom, but by architecture itself. The homes, inns, and monasteries of the period left little room for privacy. Rooms were small, walls were thin, and beds were few. To understand the persistence of these rules, you must first imagine the spaces in which they were lived. A peasant cottage of timber and daub rarely offered more than 2 rooms. One space served as kitchen, dining area, and workshop, while the other held the family bed. Sometimes the parents and infants claimed it, while older children curled against the walls on pallets of straw. At other times, everyone crammed together on the same mattress, pressed shoulder to shoulder, breathing the same air. In more prosperous homes, separation was possible but not always chosen. A chamber might hold a large bed with curtains drawn for warmth. Servants often slept at the foot of the bed, close enough to hear the whispered exchanges of their masters. In castles, the arrangement repeated itself on a grander scale. The lord and lady lay upon a raised bedstead, surrounded by attendants, guards, and companions who never strayed far. Bed curtains, so often depicted in art, were less symbols of romance than tools of survival, trapping heat and muffling sound in chambers that echoed with drafts. The rules of silence and modesty had meaning in these spaces. Without them, sleep was fractured. Too much noise and no one could rest. Too much movement and quarrels erupted. Modesty was not simply virtue. It was necessity, for the sight of another undressing in such proximity could quickly stir rumor or desire. Curtains and blankets became boundaries, flimsy yet essential. They marked the line between self and others, between what was seen and what must remain hidden. Records of inns offer further insight. A traveler might pay for a bed but find himself sharing it with two strangers. In one English case from the 15th century, a judge dismissed a complaint from a man who claimed discomfort at being made to lie with another traveler. The judge noted that such arrangements were ordinary and could not be grounds for grievance. What mattered was conduct. If one shifted too much, spoke out of turn, or touched without cause, then the unspoken contract of bed sharing was broken. The law recognized the practice as a fact of life, and the forgotten rules served as its quiet enforcement. Monastic dormitories followed yet another pattern. Monks slept side by side in long rows, each with his own narrow bed or pallet. Silence here was sacred, for speech after Compline was forbidden. Stillness was discipline, a mark of devotion to God. Yet even in such austere spaces, human needs intruded. Accounts from monasteries describe the rustle of blankets, the coughs of the sick, the restless shifting of the young. The ideal of perfect silence was unattainable, but the rule remained, guiding behavior even when it was not fully observed. For women, bed sharing held particular complexity. Maidservants often slept together for protection, guarding one another from threats in houses where their power was limited. Female companions were expected to uphold one another's reputations, for impropriety could cost them their positions. Mothers slept with daughters not only for warmth, but to safeguard their honor in households where male eyes lingered too long. In every instance, the rules of stillness and modesty shielded them, though not always successfully, from suspicion. Travelers' accounts show how foreign these customs could seem to outsiders. Italian merchants journeying through northern Europe remarked upon the habit of entire households sleeping in a single chamber. English visitors to France found themselves scandalized by the frankness with which strangers shared beds. Yet these same travelers, once weary enough, accepted the custom. Hunger, fatigue, and cold were greater forces than pride, and resistance to bed sharing often melted by the second night. The forgotten rules, then, were a language spoken silently across cultures. You learned them not through books but through experience. On your first shared night, you discovered the importance of lying still. On your second, you grasped the necessity of turning away at the proper moment. By the third, you understood why silence was valued above all. There was no written code, but everyone knew when it had been broken. A slap, a curse, or a bitter silence in the morning marked the violation, and the memory of it lingered long after. And yet, beneath the discipline, there remained a kind of intimacy impossible to erase. To sleep beside another was to hear the rhythm of his breathing, to feel the shift of his body, to know, without words, that you were not alone. In a world without privacy, such closeness was unavoidable. But perhaps it was also instructive. The medieval self was not bounded by walls or locks, but defined in relation to others. Each night reinforced this truth, as rules sought to shape a fragile peace within the shared vulnerability of sleep. So one must ask, if these rules were so vital, what happened when they collapsed entirely? What stories unfolded when silence gave way to noise, when modesty dissolved into scandal, when stillness shattered into chaos? When one examines the forgotten rules of medieval bed sharing, it becomes clear that they were never as solid as they appeared. The rules could bend, falter, and even collapse under the weight of circumstance. Hunger, poverty, lust, or simple exhaustion often rewrote them in practice, even if the ideals were repeated endlessly. Section by section of daily life reveals how fragile the codes could be when tested against the reality of human nature. Imagine the household of a poor craftsman, pressed into a single damp chamber with wife, children, and perhaps a boarder for additional income. The accepted order dictated that the parents occupy the central bed, the children huddled close to the sides, and the stranger pushed to the edge. Yet children shifted in the night. The boarder coughed with fever, and the craftsman himself rose to stoke the fire. Each movement disrupted the fragile choreography of rest. Resentments brewed easily. A boy stealing too much blanket, a stranger pressing too close, or a mother rising too often to hush her baby could unravel the unspoken compact. By dawn, small quarrels often hardened into spoken disputes, reminders that the rules demanded constant reinforcement because they were so easily violated. In taverns and inns, the collapse was even more visible. Stories abound of quarrels between strangers forced to share a bed. Some accused their companions of theft, claiming a missing coin or dagger come morning. Others charged them with drunken disorder, recounting nights filled with snores, muttered curses, or staggering trips to the chamber pot. The innkeeper's role, then, was not only to provide lodging but to mediate disputes born of shared beds. Rules of silence and stillness mattered here not for virtue but for commerce. Without them, customers refused to return. Yet, despite the complaints, most travelers had no choice but to accept the conditions. Roads were dangerous, and an inn's communal bed remained safer than a ditch by the roadside. Even in the halls of the mighty, the rules cracked. Chronicles note the scandals that erupted when members of royal courts shared chambers too freely. A careless word uttered in sleep could become evidence of treason. A wandering hand or whispered confession in the dark could spark rumors that traveled from servant to noble in hours. Court etiquette manuals, obsessed with proper behavior, devoted lines not only to the table and the hunt, but to the bedchamber, urging discretion, stillness, and restraint. Yet these same courts were hotbeds of intrigue precisely because the rules could not prevent human weakness. In monasteries, the collapse of discipline was taken as a spiritual warning. Records of visitations by bishops reveal repeated complaints of monks whispering after the hour of silence, or of young novices slipping from their pallets to converse. To sleep in proximity was to invite temptation, whether of words, laughter, or worse. The rigid enforcement of silence thus masked an awareness that rules alone could not contain desire. When breaches were discovered, punishment was swift. Yet the need for constant correction shows how persistent the weakness was, and how easily silence could shatter. Among women, the fragility of the rules was even more evident. Servants sleeping in crowded quarters often told stories of harassment, of men intruding upon their space despite the unwritten codes. Mothers tried to shield their daughters, but poverty left little room for safety. The rules of modesty provided cover in theory but rarely sufficient protection in practice. To accuse a master or a fellow servant of impropriety was dangerous, for the word of the vulnerable carried little weight. Thus, bedsharing often carried risks that the rules attempted to disguise. Despite these frequent breaches, the rules endured. People clung to them precisely because they were so often broken. They offered a framework of expectation in a world where enforcement was weak. To insist on silence, stillness, and modesty was to set a standard, even if nightly life regularly fell short. The tension between ideal and practice shaped the medieval experience of sleep more than the rules themselves. It was this tension that left its mark on law, literature, and memory. You must imagine, too, how fragile trust was in the dark. To lie beside another was to surrender your guard. If he rolled too close, if she shifted without explanation, suspicion grew instantly. A knife could appear as easily as a cough. A stolen glance could become a whispered scandal. In such circumstances, the rules became more than etiquette. They were survival strategies. designed to allow vulnerable bodies to endure the night together without violence. But what of those times when the collapse of rules turned not to violence, but to intimacy? What relationships were formed? What confidences shared? When two lay together in the stillness of night and the code dissolved into conversation? How many marriages began with a moment of quiet whispering across a shared blanket? How many secrets slipped into the air when all others were asleep? If the rules enforced silence, modesty, and stillness, perhaps their breaking carried an equal significance, shaping bonds that history never recorded. And so the question lingers. When silence dissolved into speech, when stillness gave way to touch, when modesty was abandoned, did these moments mark shameful violations? Or did they reveal something deeper about the unrecorded bonds of human life? When the rules of medieval bedsharing endured despite constant tension, they became not only a part of daily survival, but also a mirror of wider society. The arrangement of bodies within the bed was never a simple matter of comfort. It was a reflection of hierarchy, kinship, obligation, and sometimes punishment. To study where each person lay is to study the structure of the medieval world itself. In the peasant's cottage, hierarchy was enforced through the placement of sleepers. The father, considered the head of the household, occupied the central and most secure position, often with his wife close beside him. Children clustered around them, and if strangers were admitted, they found themselves at the edges, both physically and symbolically marginal. This arrangement reinforced the authority of the parent over the household, even in sleep. The body's position reminded each member of where they stood. To defy that structure by refusing one's assigned place was to risk not only a quarrel but also the subtle charge of rebellion. In noble households, bedsharing likewise mirrored status. Servants slept at the foot of their lord's bed or on straw pallets placed nearby, not for comfort but to provide protection and service at all hours. Proximity to the master's body was both a privilege and a duty. Pages, squires, and trusted attendants were chosen for their loyalty, for to sleep so close was to hold a position of profound intimacy. The arrangement underlined the centrality of the Lord, both in waking life and in rest. The bed was no longer a simple object of sleep, but a stage on which power relations were performed silently each night. The same structure appeared in monasteries. Novices and younger monks lay at the edges of the dormitory, while senior brothers took the central positions, nearest the watchful eye of the abbot's appointed overseer. Here, too, sleep was regulated to enforce obedience. The arrangement not only limited the risk of disorder, but reminded each monk of his place in the spiritual hierarchy. To share the dormitory was to submit not only your speech and movements, but even your dreams to the authority of the community. In families, bedsharing reinforced obligations of care. Mothers sleeping with infants accepted the risk of suffocation or fever because there was no alternative. The shared warmth of the bed was the only protection a fragile child could hope for in a cold house. Siblings crowded together for survival, their small bodies pressed close, sometimes so tightly that disputes were impossible. In such cases, the rules of bedsharing gave way to a deeper rule. Survival outweighed discomfort. The codes of stillness and silence bent before the simple need to keep children alive through bitter nights. Even punishment could take the form of altered sleeping arrangements. To banish someone to the cold floor was not only to deny them comfort, but to mark them as socially diminished. In some records, wayward servants or quarrelsome children were denied the privilege of the bed, forced to find rest on straw or bare boards. The message was clear. To lose one's place in the sleeping order was to lose one's dignity and belonging. Thus, bedsharing carried with it the threat of exclusion, a reminder that the rules sustained not only peace but also identity. Travelers experienced hierarchy as well. In inns, the wealthy negotiated for space in better chambers, while the poor accepted what was left. Even within a shared bed, wealth shaped position. The paying gentleman insisted on the place nearest the wall for safety, forcing lesser companions to the vulnerable edge. Coins could purchase not privacy, but at least the illusion of security within a communal arrangement. The body itself became currency, its position bargained for like a commodity. The rules, therefore, were never neutral. They did not simply keep the peace. They enforced a structure that mirrored society's divisions. Every position in the bed carried meaning, just as every place at the table or pew in the church carried meaning. The codes of silence, stillness, and modesty reinforced not only order but inequality. The bed was a theater in which society was rehearsed each night, long after the day's labors were finished. One can imagine how this structure shaped consciousness. Children grew into adults already accustomed to their place, for they had felt it pressed into their skin since infancy. Servants learned their subordination in the very act of lying at a lord's feet. Monks submitted to silence even in dreams. Bedsharing was education as much as necessity, teaching lessons that no sermon or law could engrave so deeply. Yet what happened when these rules were defied? What did it mean when a servant crept into a forbidden place, when a child climbed over a parent's body to rest in the center, when a monk dared whisper in the night? Each breach carried symbolic weight. It was not only a small act of disorder, but a challenge to the very structure of society. That is why breaches provoked such alarm, such swift correction. To move within the bed was to move within the order of the world. The fragility of these arrangements raises a question that echoes across the centuries. If sleep itself was a mirror of hierarchy, what does that reveal about the depth of medieval inequality? Did people accept their roles more readily because they felt them pressed upon their bodies each night? Or did the intimacy of shared beds sometimes breed resistance, tiny acts of rebellion against the weight of order? If medieval bedsharing was a constant reminder of hierarchy, it was also a constant reminder of vulnerability. To lie down beside another person in the dark was to place your body in a position of risk. Every night one trusted others not to betray, not to harm, not to reveal. The rules that governed silence and stillness were born not only of etiquette, but also of fear. What might happen if one stirred too much, whispered at the wrong time, or let slip a secret in the haze between waking and sleeping? The intimacy of bedsharing meant that secrets traveled easily. A child might overhear the whispers of parents as they lay close. Servants might catch the murmurs of masters half asleep. Travelers might reveal their fears in muttered speech, only to discover the next day that a stranger had heard every word. In an age when reputation could mean life or death, the bed was both a refuge and a trap. One's breath and words could betray more than one intended, and those who shared space with others often carried the burden of unwanted knowledge. Fear of contagion was another silent thread. Illness spread quickly in communal sleep. Fevers leapt from body to body. Coughs echoed through the night, and infection had no barriers. The bed became a vector as much as a sanctuary. Families knew this, yet they had no choice. To banish a sick child to a corner of the house might protect others, but also condemn that child to a colder, more perilous night. The decision revealed the stark trade-offs of survival. The intimacy of bed-sharing preserved warmth but invited disease. There was also the problem of theft. Inns were notorious for it. To sleep beside strangers meant placing one's possessions within reach of unfamiliar hands. A belt loosened in sleep, a pouch untied, a cloak shifted ever so slightly. By morning, goods were gone. Complaints appear in court records where travelers woke lighter than they had laid down. Yet the custom endured, for the alternative was worse. Exposure to cold, the threat of robbers outside the inn's walls, or the impossible cost of a private chamber. Better to risk theft by one's fellow sleeper than violence by strangers beyond. The intimacy of bed sharing created awkwardness in questions of modesty. Men and women who were not related sometimes had no choice but to lie beside one another. Monastic travelers found themselves paired with laymen, noblewomen with maids, farmers with merchants. The rules of silence and immobility became defenses against scandal. To face the wall, to close the eyes tightly, to feign sleep even when awake, these were strategies of self-preservation. The night pressed bodies together, and so etiquette had to create distance where none physically existed. The arrangement raised moral unease as well. Preachers warned against temptation. Manuals of conduct listed dangers of lust in shared beds. Yet sermons reveal how common the practice was, for warnings are rarely issued against what is rare. The pulpit thundered about impropriety because the reality was unavoidable. The bed was not private. Boundaries that are firm in daylight blurred in darkness, and even the most pious could not escape the uncomfortable fact of proximity. One must imagine the silence that followed a day of labor. Peasants collapsing after hours in the fields pressed shoulder to shoulder. Artisans in towns crowded into small chambers with their apprentices. Soldiers in campaign tents lined up in rows, armor piled beside them, their breath mingling in the confined air. The human presence was overwhelming. It was never quiet, never entirely private. The sound of snoring, coughing, shifting, and breathing created a constant hum. Sleep was possible not in the absence of sound, but because the sound became familiar. To rest meant to surrender to that collective rhythm. Yet within that rhythm, boundaries remained fragile. A sharp movement could rouse suspicion. A whispered word could cause unrest. A single cough might stir dread of plague. Trust was necessary, but trust was never certain. The bed became a nightly negotiation of fear and dependence. One submitted to it because there was no alternative. And each morning that one awoke unharmed reinforced the fragile confidence that the rules worked. And here is the tension that lingers as you picture it. How much of the medieval night was shaped by fear disguised as order? How many rules of silence, stillness, and position were born not of courtesy but of anxiety that any breach might unravel the delicate peace of the household? If one false move could shift power, betray secrets, spread disease, or invite theft, then how truly safe was any sleeper in a medieval bed? To understand the forgotten rules of medieval bed sharing, one must also understand how the practice gradually faded. It did not vanish suddenly, but declined through centuries of social, architectural, and cultural change. As towns expanded and trade enriched the middle classes, houses grew larger. Private chambers became possible, not only for lords but also for merchants, artisans, and eventually farmers. With these new spaces came new ideas about privacy. The bed began to retreat from the communal center of family life to a more secluded corner, guarded by walls, doors, and eventually locks. The Reformation and the spread of Protestant values in parts of Europe also encouraged new expectations of modesty. Sermons spoke not only of the dangers of lust, but of the moral value of separation. Husbands and wives might still share, but siblings were divided, and servants were placed apart. Where Catholic traditions had often emphasized collective life, Protestant reformers stressed the individual soul. Privacy in sleep became a reflection of moral purity, a visible expression of inner discipline. By the 17th century, the wealthy regarded bed sharing as a mark of poverty. Manuals of household management advised against it, framing solitary sleep as healthier, cleaner, and more civilized. The very rules that had once regulated communal rest were reframed as proof of lower status. To share a bed was to admit one's lack of means. What had been ordinary became stigmatized, yet echoes of the old rules lingered. In rural villages, bed-sharing endured well into the 19th century. Farmers' cottages could not afford the luxury of empty space. Inns in remote regions still forced strangers together. Even in industrial cities, where tenements packed families into a few rooms, multiple people often lay side by side on narrow mattresses. Diaries of workers and immigrants tell of the same negotiations of silence, stillness, and respect that had guided their medieval ancestors. The memory of those unspoken rules became embedded in folk sayings and old customs. "Lie still or lose respect" was a proverb whispered to children. "The wall has ears" became a warning not to speak carelessly at night. The very language of caution preserved fragments of the etiquette that once governed every shared bed. Those phrases, still faintly recognizable today, are remnants of a time when nighttime intimacy was unavoidable. To look back now is to realize how far removed modern life is from such realities. The bed today is imagined as the most private of spaces, guarded fiercely, protected by walls, locks, and personal ownership. To sleep beside another without consent is seen as a violation rather than a necessity. Yet, for most of human history, sleep was never solitary. To rest was to enter into a fragile social contract, renewed every night and renegotiated by every cough, every shift, every whisper. And what of the lessons this forgotten practice leaves us? Perhaps it is that survival has always demanded compromise. Warmth over comfort, safety over privacy, silence over expression. Perhaps it is that what feels natural now, solitary sleep, private rooms, beds as symbols of intimacy, are inventions of a relatively recent age. For centuries before, the night belonged not to individuals but to groups, bound by trust, necessity, and unspoken rules. So imagine again the medieval chamber, its shutters closed, its straw mattress creaking under the weight of 2, 3, or more bodies. Imagine the effort to lie still, the deliberate turning of the back, the careful quiet of breath. Imagine the unspoken vow made every night to endure the presence of others until dawn. And then ask yourself, if privacy is a modern luxury, what might future generations call strange about the way we sleep today?